Joaquin Castro and Tulsi Gabbard never imagined their names would collide in one of the most intense exchanges seen in Congress this year. But that's exactly what happened when Castro unleashed a moment so raw, so unfiltered, that the entire room froze. It began with a single question, one that cut deeper than anyone expected. What happens when the people trusted to protect the truth decide to bend it? Because that's what this hearing exposed. A quiet manipulation of national security language.
Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. Tulsi, you and I came into the Congress together in 2013. And Cash, you and I was serving on the Intelligence Committee when you worked on the Intelligence Committee. And John, you and I are both from Texas, and we both served together on the Intelligence Committee. The idea that this information, if it was presented to our committee, would not be classified, y'all know is a lie. That's ridiculous. I've seen things much less sensitive be presented to us with high classification. And to say that it isn't is a lie to the country. I want to ask the generals now. The NSA is principally in charge of intercepting things like signals intelligence from other countries. General, I want to ask you, if your organization, your agency, intercepted something like this from Russia or China or some other country, would you consider this classified information?
Representative, we would be classifying based off of our sources and methods. So those would be the things that, in terms of how we process, how we would be able to obtain the information and how we'd report it,
Sure.
we would classify based off of our source and method.
So if you knew that the Secretary of Defense and the National Security Advisor of Russia or China and the head of the Foreign Ministry and all of the folks who were associated with that signal chain, if you intercepted that information, General, would you consider it classified?
So it would be classified based off of our collections.
So the NSA would classify it, would
Based off
determine it as
of
classified.
the protection of our own source and method, not necessarily based off the content, but how we collected that information.
But it would be classified.
Well, we certainly wouldn't be collecting on a U.S. person conversation.
No, I understand. I'm
We're
saying
collecting
if you did your job and collected it from the Russian Foreign Ministry and the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of Defense and the President's Chief Advisor, there is no way, having sat on this committee for 9 years, that somebody would come in with that information and give us something that says, unclassified, you can walk out of this room with this information and give it to whomever you want. You know, with all respect, you and I worked on the committee at the same time. Tulsi, you and I came in together. I've never had an issue of beef with you. John, you and I are both from Texas. Y'all know that's a lie. It's a lie to the country. I want to ask about the Alien Enemies Act really quick while I have time. The President has used the Alien Enemies Act, a wartime authority last used to detain German and Japanese nationals during World War II, to summarily deport people accused of being members of the Venezuelan gang Tren de Agua. To invoke this law, the President must demonstrate that the United States is under invasion by a foreign nation or government. They have alleged that we are under invasion by the Venezuelan government. The idea that we are at war with Venezuela would come as a surprise to most Americans. The unclassified version of the annual threat assessment the intelligence community just released makes no mention of any invasion or war that we are fighting with the nation of Venezuela. You would think our nation being at war would merit at least a small reference in this threat assessment. And Director Ratcliffe, does the intelligence community assess that we are currently at war or being invaded by the nation of Venezuela?
We have no assessment that says that.
Thank you. In invoking the law, the President alleged that Tren de Agua is, quote, undertaking hostile actions against the U.S. at the direction, clandestine or otherwise, of the Maduro regime in Venezuela. Director Gabbard, does the intelligence community assess that the Venezuelan government is directing Tren de Agua's hostile actions against the United States?
There are varied assessments that came from different intelligence community elements. I'll defer to Director Patel to speak specifically to the FBI assessment.
But let me ask you, so you're saying there are conflicting assessments that have come from the IC?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. We'll take it up in closed session. All right. You know, your threat assessment makes issue of, highlights fentanyl trafficking as a top threat to the United States, yet support for law enforcement cooperation with Mexico has been put on hold, and there's been a threat of invasion to Mexico by the United States. You assess that Russia's advanced cyber capabilities make it a persistent counterintelligence cyber threat, yet the administration shut down the unit at the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Agency tasked with stopping Russian cyber attacks. There are so many other ways that the actions of this administration have contradicted this threat assessment, and the administration is making the world and the United States more dangerous. I yield back.
The gentleman yields.
A leaked signal chat that should have been locked away, but suddenly wasn't. And a claim about a foreign invasion so extreme that even the intelligence community couldn't back it up. The crazy part? Castro didn't tiptoe around it. He didn't hint, he didn't imply. He looked the intelligence chiefs he once worked alongside dead in the eye and said it straight. Y'all know that's a lie. Not whispered, not softened. He called out the entire structure in front of cameras, the country, and the officials who knew exactly what he meant. And what came next exposed something far more alarming than a disagreement over classification. It revealed a pattern, a subtle rewriting of reality that most Americans would never see unless someone like Castro dragged it out into the light. The tension started when he pressed the intelligence leaders on whether the United States was, as the administration claimed, being invaded by Venezuela. It sounded absurd, almost theatrical, but the consequences weren't. This claim wasn't just a headline. It was the foundation for invoking a wartime authority not used in decades. A law from an era of mass detentions and wartime paranoia suddenly revived to justify rapid deportations. But even before he reached that issue, Castro made something clear. These intelligence leaders were pretending that sensitive military discussions, leaked in a private signal chat, weren't classified. And that, to him, was an insult to anyone who had ever served on the Intelligence Committee. Castro and Gabbard entered Congress together in 2013. They sat in the same secure rooms, listened to the same briefings, watched entire folders get stamped top secret for information that was far less sensitive than the leak being discussed. He reminded them of that history. And he reminded the public, too. Because when he said, "I've seen things much less sensitive be presented with high classification," it wasn't hyperbole. It was lived experience. It was his way of saying, you know better. And you know exactly what you're doing. This wasn't about minor bureaucratic disagreements. This was about a fundamental truth. The classification system is supposed to protect national security, not political convenience. And when Castro pressed the NSA general with a hypothetical scenario, asking whether the same information would be classified if it had come from Russia or China, he wasn't fishing. He was proving a point he knew the public needed to hear. Would the U.S. classify intercepted communications involving a foreign minister, a national security advisor, and high-level military figures from another nation? The general hesitated, but everyone knew the answer. Of course it would be classified. The NSA's whole job depends on protecting sources, methods, and high-level intelligence. And yet, here they were, acting as if this leak was no big deal. As if the public should believe that something involving top-level officials was suddenly unclassified just because it was inconvenient to treat it as sensitive. Castro's frustration wasn't about politics. It was about trust. Because if intelligence officials can decide, on the fly, that something normally considered top secret suddenly isn't, then oversight becomes meaningless. And that's where the danger begins. But that wasn't the whole story. The leak wasn't the only moment of selective truth-telling that day. Castro shifted to something far more explosive. The administration's decision to invoke the Alien Enemies Act, a wartime authority so rarely used that most Americans have never heard of it. This law, created more than a century ago, had been used during World War I and World War II to detain nationals from enemy countries. It was a drastic measure, one that historically created real harm, real abuses, and real violations of civil liberties. Yet here it was again, pulled from the archives and used to deport people alleged to be part of a Venezuelan gang. Not proven, not charged, alleged. And the law required one very specific condition. the United States must be under invasion by a foreign nation, meaning someone in power had to argue and sign off that Venezuela was attacking the United States. And that's where Castro's voice sharpened with disbelief. Because if the U.S. were truly under invasion, you'd expect to see it in the intelligence community's threat assessment. You'd expect hearings, briefings, public alerts. You'd expect at least one paragraph acknowledging such a crisis. Yet the threat assessment said nothing about any invasion. Not even a hint. That's why Castro asked the question point blank. Does the intelligence community assess that we are currently at war or being invaded by the nation of Venezuela? Director Ratcliffe didn't deflect. He didn't spin. He simply said, "We have no assessment that says that." And in that instant, the entire justification for the wartime authority cracked open. If the intelligence agencies had no such assessment, then where did this invasion claim come from? Rumors online suggested the administration was relying on vague accusations that a Venezuelan gang was acting at the direction of the Maduro regime. But even that wasn't solid. When Castro pressed Director Gabbard on whether the intelligence community assessed that Venezuela was directing hostile actions, she admitted something rarely said publicly. There are varied assessments. Varied, not firm, not confirmed, not unified. The exact opposite of the certainty required to invoke wartime powers. Reports claim that inside the intelligence community, some analysts believe the rhetoric was exaggerated. Others speculated that invoking wartime authority was a strategic move to accelerate deportations that wouldn't survive standard legal challenges. These claims remain unverified, but the fact that Castro raised them at all shows how deeply the issue rattled Congress, because everything pointed to one conclusion. The language of national security was being weaponized, and that's what made Castro's confrontation so powerful. He wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. He was trying to expose a truth that risked being buried beneath political talking points. When he said, "It's a lie to the country," he wasn't grandstanding. He was voicing what many people in the room already suspected but were too cautious to say out loud. Castro's argument was simple: national security should never be used as camouflage for political goals. If the United States is not at war, leaders shouldn't claim it is. If intelligence hasn't confirmed a foreign-directed attack, leaders shouldn't pretend otherwise. And if a leak involves top officials, it should be classified consistently, not downgraded to avoid accountability. But the most chilling part of the hearing wasn't the back and forth. It was what the moment symbolized: a government's power to redefine reality, to turn a routine law enforcement action into a wartime emergency, to turn an embarrassing leak into nothing special, and to turn legitimate oversight questions into political nuisances instead of constitutional obligations. The intelligence system relies on public trust. It relies on agencies telling the truth even when the truth is uncomfortable. But in this hearing, Castro forced everyone watching to confront a harder question. What happens when the truth becomes optional? And just as it seemed the room might calm, Castro hammered the point again. He laid out the contradiction. If the same information had come from a foreign power, the NSA would classify it instantly. Everyone in that room knew it. Everyone watching at home knew it. Because that's how national security works. Yet these officials insisted they weren't treating it as classified because of how it was collected. And that's when Castro snapped. "Y'all know that's a lie." It wasn't anger. It was disbelief. Because after 9 years on the Intelligence Committee, Castro understood exactly what classified information looks like. And he understood when someone was trying to pretend a fire wasn't burning in front of them. His words weren't just a challenge. They were a warning. The hearing turned from a Q&A into a test of integrity. A moment when officials had to choose between honesty and loyalty to a narrative. And the country got a rare glimpse into the tension buried beneath years of carefully crafted public statements. Rumors suggest multiple agencies were uncomfortable with how the wartime claim was being used, but none wanted to be the one to contradict the administration publicly. That left Congress to do what intelligence agencies often cannot: call out the inconsistencies. And Castro knew something else, too. When the government overstates threats, real threats get ignored. When officials manipulate the classification system, the public loses faith in the entire process. When leaders cry invasion without evidence, people stop listening when an actual danger appears. That's why Castro ended his questioning by tying everything back to fentanyl trafficking. The threat assessment named it a top priority. Yet support for cooperation with Mexico, one of the most important tools for fighting trafficking, was being put on hold. And at the same time, the administration was threatening military action against Mexico itself. It made no sense. It was the kind of contradiction that doesn't happen by accident. It happens when narratives become more important than facts. That Castro's confrontation didn't resolve everything. It didn't magically force an admission or a reversal, but it cracked the surface. It exposed competing truths, clashing agendas, and the uncomfortable reality that power doesn't always align with accountability. It forced intelligence leaders to answer questions they would have preferred to dodge, and it reminded the country that oversight exists for a reason. Because if someone doesn't ask the hard questions, the easy lies become normal, and that's why this moment resonated far beyond that hearing room. It wasn't about left or right. It wasn't about party loyalty. It was about one representative refusing to let national security become a political toy. It was about reminding everyone, from agency directors to the public, that truth is not optional. Not in a democracy. Not when the stakes involve wartime law. Not when the consequences affect thousands of lives. That Castro's final message wasn't spoken, but it echoed through everything he said. If leaders can rewrite reality whenever they choose, the public must demand answers louder than ever before. If you believe transparency and accountability still matter, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more breakdowns like this, and share it with someone who needs to see what's really going on behind the scenes. The truth deserves a spotlight, especially when others try to hide it.